Hello, everyone, and a very warm welcome to today's webinar. Our topic today is From Gang Curfews to Predation, Criminal Governance During COVID in 5 Cities. Today's event is brought to you by the Global Initiative Against Transnational Organized Crime. My name is Lindy Mtongana. I am your host for today. I'm a broadcast journalist based out of Nairobi, Kenya, and it is my great pleasure to welcome you to today's presentation from wherever in the world you might be joining us from. Now, today's discussion is taking place in both English and Spanish. So if you would like to listen to the interpretation in either of those 2 languages, just look at the bottom of your Zoom screen. There's a tab at the bottom that says interpretation, and you can click to listen to today's proceedings in English, or you can listen to the Spanish translation. Well, for over a year now, the Global Initiative, with the support of the German Agency for International Cooperation, known as the GIZ, has been conducting a comparative study of criminal governance in urban areas during the COVID-19 pandemic. The study essentially followed how gangs set rules and influence communities through the provision of security and essential services in urban areas in cities of Africa and Latin America. To be more specific, the case studies in this project are based in Tumaco, Colombia, Rio de Janeiro, Brazil, Nairobi, Kenya, Cape Town, South Africa, and San Salvador, El Salvador. Today's event in particular will summarize the main findings of the study with a special look at San Salvador. Our program also includes a special video titled Criminal Governance in Cities During the Pandemic. Now, this video contains interviews with former gang members, civil society leaders, and experts, and then it's followed by a 30-minute discussion with our panel for today. And just to briefly mention who is on our panel, we are joined by Antônio Sampaio, who led this project on criminal governance during the COVID pandemic. He is a senior analyst at the Global Initiative Against Transnational Organized Crime, who specializes in urban armed violence, non-state armed groups, and their impact on governance and security. He also studies conflict economies and the roles of cities in wars, and his research has been focused on Latin America, as well as Somalia, Afghanistan, and Pakistan. We're also joined today by Juan José Martínez da Buisson, a socio-cultural anthropologist who specializes in issues of violence, gangs, and social marginalization in El Salvador. He is the author of A Year Inside MS-13 and The Hollywood Kid, or El Niño de Hollywood. Both books expose life inside one of the largest and most violent gangs in the world. He has also contributed extensively to edited volumes and academic journals. But before we hear from our panelists, as well as watch this video I just mentioned, first of all, we'd like to give a warm welcome to Babette Ullemeyer. She's the advisor at the GIZ Sector Program for Peace and Security and Disaster Risk Management. Of course, the GIZ has been a strong supporter of this project from the very beginning, without whom it would not have been possible. So over to you, Babette.
Thank you very much, Lindy, for this warm welcome, and also thank you very much for inviting me to give the opening remarks to the launch of this new report. As Lindy just said, I'm Babette Ullemeyer. I'm working and also here today as a representative of GIZ. I'm working at the sector program, Peace, Security and Disaster Risk Management, advising the German Federal Ministry for Economic Cooperation and Development, abbreviated as BMZ, or also known as BMZ. I'm very happy to be here as a representative of GIZ and our sector program, and also want to thank the GI for the great work they have put into all those individual case studies, as well as the report that brings them all together and binds them and draws final conclusions from them all. For us as GIZ and as a sector program, as well as for the BMZ department, it is very important to understand the root causes of fragility and conflict, how they are shaped and how also they are changing. And as we all know, there are strong connections between transnational organized crime, fragility, and violent conflicts. And for us, it is very important also to know how the COVID pandemic affected those different areas and how also the conflicts and fragility drivers shaped and changed and also maybe fueled new or already latent or breeding existing conflicts. Therefore, for us, it is very helpful to have an insight on those case studies, on different examples, to take it as a solid research basis for our further work, as it shows a distinct picture of how the roles of criminal groups and criminal governance changed during the pandemic and what effect it had on local structures and how it weakened the role of the state in those areas and how they also drove some of those communities also further into fragility. Thank you very much for the good work you've put into it. Thank you for inviting us. Thank you also for the good cooperation between our organizations so far. And I'm very much looking forward to the launch today, the video, and also the discussion afterwards. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Babette Ullemeyer, for those opening remarks. I think Babette has actually very nicely just highlighted the reasons why such research is so valuable and so important. So without any further ado, let's now take a look at the video I mentioned earlier. It's titled Criminal Governance in Cities During the Pandemic, and it'll give us some insight into how criminal gangs adapted during the COVID-19 pandemic and how communities, civil society actors, and state actors responded. Enjoy. Hello and welcome to Criminal Governance During COVID, brought to you by the Global Initiative Against Transnational Organized Crime. I'm Lindy Mtongana. In this half hour, we'll be taking a look at those parts of the world where criminal gangs and not governments are in charge. During the pandemic, states across the globe showed their strength or lack of it with financial rescue packages, vaccines, healthcare, the imposition of lockdowns, and even hitting back at organized crime. But what about those parts of the world where many states still fear to tread? We've seen criminal groups enforce their own rules and lockdowns, prohibit certain behaviors, and even punish those who do not obey. In some areas, they've restricted access to resources, taxed businesses, or provided food and other forms of support as a way of influencing the people in the territories they control. So, has criminal governance strengthened its grip during COVID? And if so, in what ways and why? To explore this, we'll hear from two former gang members, activists, and people for whom contact with gangs is part of everyday life. I'll also be speaking to some of the world's top experts on criminal governance. And the Global Initiative really wants to hear your views and your experiences of criminal governance during the pandemic. It helps inform their research. So please do get involved and become part of this conversation on social media using the hashtag COVIDCrimeWatch. But to kick us off, let's get some perspective of criminal governance on the ground and how it's altered during the pandemic.
When you go to West Point, for example, they run their own show. Even the government is afraid of that place. They move with machetes, cutlasses, knives, and guns.
They tax small businesses. They make them pay tax for protection, but essentially the protection is from them.
One of the things that they do is curtail resources. For example, they block communities from accessing transport, that is the public transport. They start controlling the transport industry. We also see them withholding essential services such as water, power, even controlling rent.
COVID created a number of opportunities for criminals. Security and criminal justice was put on pause.
Algunos integrantes de grupos que se asumen del crimen organizado han golpeado a pobladores y han difundido videos en donde por no usar cubrebocas los mismos ciudadanos son sancionados por estos integrantes del crimen organizado.
Existia, de certa forma, um toque de recolher, caso a pessoa efetuasse, saísse de casa no tardar da noite, poderia ocorrer algum tipo de punição.
The sad thing is we celebrate Freedom Day every year, but nothing changes. We're not free because we don't have freedom of movement because some kind of gangs just took it away.
Some really powerful testimony there from people living at the sharp end. A big welcome now to Antônio Sampaio, a senior analyst at the Global Initiative who has been researching criminal governance during COVID. Now, at the start of the pandemic, the Global Initiative launched COVID Crime Watch, an initiative which explores the impact of COVID-19 on illicit markets across the globe. Experts from the GI have provided research and analysis about a breadth of topics, including how criminal groups have exerted control in place of the government. Antônio's research is, of course, required reading for anyone interested in the subject. You can find his work, along with reports from other GI experts, on the Global Initiative website. Antônio, gangs have often been compared to primitive states. Why is that?
Thanks, Lindy. Yes, there is still a lingering impression of gangs and criminals in general as sort of juvenile delinquents or troublemakers. Sometimes people, say that criminals are led to this life out of underdevelopment or poverty, and whereas these factors are indeed very important in being drivers of individual pathways to crime, when you think about gangs as organized outlets, as organizations, they are way more sophisticated than that. Research, including our research, has documented cases in which gangs and other armed groups have come to perform really social and political roles in the local level, especially in low-income urban areas, peripheries, slums in the developing world. So in terms of this role as primitive states, it really comes down to how gangs perform sometimes when they are really organized and well-armed, roles as providing local order or alternative orders in terms of regulating life, providing rules for the population, providing a rough form of security in terms of, you can't rob in this area, you can't commit, crimes in this area, even when gangs do commit these crimes and other things in other areas. But in dirt territories, they provide a rough form of security that, of course, comes accompanied by some, and in some cases, a lot of predation and exploitation, extortion to businesses and sometimes to individuals as well. So it's not they don't do that out of the goodness of their hearts, but there is a level of order and security that they provide in areas that have been essentially excluded or left out by the basic governance aspects, the services, the security that modern states have been, become associated with.
A really interesting point there from Antônio. But now let's hear from two former gang members about what they say are their roles in these so-called primitive states.
Our rules is first, you have to pay. Number two, you have to know that we own that street. Number three is even the police are below us.
We are the kings in our community. Everyone, especially our peers, really feared us. They see what you do.
I remember there was a time I had the power to go into a police station and go and tell the police, like, that guy in the cell is my staff. Just remove him from the cell.
Within our boundaries, in our hood, no one will bring trouble. We'll come in and we ensure we solve the problem. To keep the peace, we'll protect them and protect the resources within our area to go directly benefit the people in our community.
We had what we call Pesa Mbwa. That was like a local tax to the public transport system. If you failed to pay us the tax, we can guarantee you by the next day nobody will be climbing your vehicle. Because anytime a client gets into your vehicle, we rob them.
We used to protect some businesses who pay us to protect them. And if we try to break there, we look for you, we beat you, and we ensure you return everything that you stole.
There was loss of lives. We could maim people, damage properties, arsonery, all as long as we just make the statement, you have to play by our game.
We never wanted to see the cases of rape, gender-based violence, sexual harassment, petty crimes like snatching, breaking and stealing. So that's the thing we used to enforce because we wanted to protect ourselves and community know us like leaders. Our organization is trying to empower through changing, transforming youth who are lost in drugs, crime, commercial sex work, early marriages, dropouts. So our bottom line is unifying and changing them through sports. So once we enroll them in sports, we engage them in other activities like community services. The main objective is teaching the youth the virtue of serving others and expecting nothing in return.
I've worked with over 50 youths in Kibera. 10 to 20 have been paying their school fees through their art. It's been a long journey, but I'm grateful to God and to the friends and the people who've believed in me.
Thank you to coaches and Stephen in Nairobi for talking to us about their existence in gangs and their lives now. But how do organized criminal groups adapt in times of crisis? Outside wartime, governments across the world may never have had to react so quickly and at such scale to events as during the pandemic. So what happens to people when the state can't or won't provide basic services or security? I'm delighted to be joined by Kyle Johnson now, a researcher at Fundación Conflict Responses. Kyle's work in Colombia formed part of Antônio's research project. He looked at armed groups in the port city of Tumaco, which is located near the Ecuadorian border and serves as an important node for transnational drug trafficking. Kyle, how did armed groups adapt in Tumaco during COVID? What roles did they perform that we might have expected to have been undertaken by the state?
During the pandemic, there were two main armed groups in the city, two main gangs, who actually performed very different roles. During the first maybe 6 months of the pandemic, where fear amongst Tumaco society was very high of the pandemic and of people getting sick and dying, the gangs mainly played a role of restricting movement, making sure that meetings weren't happening, making sure that parties weren't happening. People who had kind of high-risk jobs, such as taxi drivers, could not move as well. At the same time, in some specific neighborhoods, the gangs there performed no role whatsoever. They did not believe in COVID. They thought it was a hoax. And so believing it was a hoax, they did not enforce any rules at all. People could move about as they pleased. and they could even hold parties or anything like that. And so the interesting thing is that the variance in the gangs' response to COVID very much reflected how Tumacan society saw COVID. What is also interesting is that they gave no aid whatsoever. They didn't give out food, they didn't give out water, they didn't give out money. Basically, their role was mainly restrictive over anything.
So in those communities where the armed groups had a particularly strong degree on influence on the community and were able to impose restrictions, as you mentioned, how did this compare to those areas that were more under the government's control?
Well, I think the restrictions, according to the people we spoke to, were more effective in the areas under gang control. And this is probably just because they have much tighter control than the government has in the areas that are more under government control, should we say. Also, the punishment mechanisms of fines, threats, and the threat of being killed, which many people feared, tended to be more effective than the government, who was handing out fines and tickets, but had no way of actually getting people to pay those fines. But in the areas under gang control, where violence is common, that strong control and that threat of violence were very effective in making sure that people actually followed the rules they did impose in Tumaco.
So it's quite interesting that in Tumaco, these armed groups did not provide aid. But let's look at some pictures of aid distribution. Not what you might expect. They include the daughter of the billionaire former leader of the Sinaloa drug cartel, El Chapo. She's handing out food parcels to the poor during COVID. Drug trafficking groups have also distributed supplies in Mexican cities, and a similar, if limited, food distribution initiative was undertaken by gangs in Cape Town, South Africa. So, Antônio, to what extent do you think we should take this type of organized benevolence at face value? And to what extent should we see it as the propaganda of gangsters who in reality prey upon the same vulnerable people they profess to be helping?
I think there is an element of benevolence sometimes. For instance, in our study, we saw that in Cape Town, gangs established a very limited truce that ended up not becoming effectively, real, because it broke down very, very quickly. And it also involved some provision of food supplies to communities, but that provision came accompanied by some demands for the recipients of that aid to help the gangs move drugs and weapons.
Yeah, indeed. And sometimes that benevolence is conditional. Thank you so much to both Kyle and Antônio there. So what role has the state played in the lives of people who live in areas controlled by gangs during the pandemic? How have police forces and governments tried to tackle the issue of criminal governance? And have their efforts improved the situation or made things worse? Let's begin by taking a look at one police response from Brazil, described by Amnesty International as completely unacceptable. This film contains some disturbing images.
Não sabe com que ele está se deparando. O nível de estresse de um policial. Não estou falando só preparado fisicamente, estou falando preparado psicologicamente para esse tipo de problema, sobretudo numa situação tão complexa como uma do Rio de Janeiro.
Filha do meu amigo, justamente! Eu quero justiça!
Infelizmente, pela situação, são regiões com muita vulnerabilidade social, você tem, principalmente em momentos de crise econômica, vamos dizer, entre aspas, um exército de reserva, né, que há muito vem substituindo as pessoas que têm morrido. Então, a morte de um ou de outro pode aparentar para o senso comum que há uma solução, pelo contrário, né, aquelas pessoas são repostas e a população fica, violentada de duas formas. Tanto uma polícia que é muito violenta, não sabe identificar de fato quem é um criminoso e quem é um morador, e acaba cometendo uma série de arbitrariedades e violência, Isso faz com que ela perca a sua credibilidade, que é dos maiores capitais de uma polícia numa ordem democrática.
Well, that video certainly illustrates just how complex that relationship can be between state and non-state actors. And thank you to Hobson Rodriguez there, the former deputy head of Rio's military police, for his valuable insight into that operation. Well, to discuss the role of the police further, I'm now joined by Hussein Khalid, the Executive Director of Haki Africa. It's an organization which seeks to foster the progressive realization of human rights. Hussein is a lawyer by profession. Welcome to the conversation, Hussein. First of all, what's your reaction to that video that we just saw? And I ask this from the perspective of the extent to which this represents police tactics around the world during the pandemic. In your view, did you see similar events taking place in Africa?
Yes, thank you so much, Lindy, for having me. And just to answer directly, yes, we did actually witness similar scenes in Africa. And if I may give an example of one particular incident that I followed up on in Kenya in around May. This is just like 2-3 months after the pandemic had seriously hit Kenya. And we saw an incident where the police officers are alleged to have been involved in the raid of a suspect. And in the process, a 3-year-old girl was killed. A 6-year-old boy was also killed, and a fetus. Apparently, the mother was shot in the stomach, and the bullet was lodged in the fetus, and it died. So these incidences, unfortunately, became rampant during this pandemic. Here in Kenya, the first day of the curfew, we saw people who were tear gassed, people who were trying to rush home, people who were trying to making it to the ferry so that they can beat the deadline. But even before the deadline, we saw how the police, in the excuse of enforcing social distancing, mishandled or manhandled communities and crowds of people to the extent of tear gassing women and children. So these kinds of incidences, unfortunately, were reported in a number of African countries, not just in Kenya. We saw a similar thing in Uganda. We saw similar cases, for example, in Nigeria, in places such as South Africa.
Hussein, you mentioned the police's sometimes heavy-handed implementation of curfews and social distancing rules over populations. But how did the pandemic affect the way they dealt with organized criminal groups?
Oh, yes. I think this also presented an opportunity to the police, or so to speak, to kind of, I would say, rein in on these gangs. For many, to them, this appeared to be a good opportunity to silence these gangs. I know the example of Kenya. We've seen a number of raids and attacks in different parts of the country where gangs were, raided and killed. I know of an incident where around 5 gang members were killed during the same incident. In different parts of Africa, we've read about this, for example, in Ethiopia, where we've seen these kinds of issues being reported. We've also reported similar things in the north, in Tunisia, in Egypt, and related places.
And Hussein, taking a moment to look at this now from the perspective of the police, I mean, in some instances, they're dealing with heavily armed gangs who are not afraid to shoot if necessary. So what can police actually do in these circumstances? How can they really engage in particular areas if they fear that they may be shot? Is it a case that the police are damned if they do and damned if they don't?
Yeah, that's a very interesting question. It is always thrown at us as human rights defenders, when we come out and we say that police cannot use excessive force in enhancing security. It always has to be reasonable. And the question of who decides what is reasonable always comes up, And I agree that sometimes it's difficult to tell. I think for us, many of the incidences where killings were reported, eyewitnesses have come out and communicated that in a number of cases, these individuals were already arrested, they had already surrendered, They were already clearly in the control of the police, but at the same time, or at the end of it all, they still ended up being killed. And unfortunately, this has been the case in many African countries. The law is clear that everyone is innocent until proven guilty by a court of law, not by the police service, not by the community, which is also at times very loud. When criminals are killed, when people come out and say this should not happen, communities sometimes support the police because they say, oh yes, they've done a good job. These are people who are causing harm to the community. They are killing people. So when police kill criminals, in most cases, you'll find that the communities support what the police are doing. And that is not right because we know the law is the law.
Exactly. Well, thank you so much. A lot of food for thought there. Hussein Khalid from Haki Africa. Well, let's turn now to the role of civil society organizations, NGOs, and activists during the pandemic. Cecilia Oliveira is a journalist and the founder of Fogo Cruzado, a crowdsourced armed violence data website. I spoke to her recently and began by asking her whether in places where there is no effective state, the role of civil society, activists, and NGOs becomes more necessary than ever.
Here in Brazil, the state has some degree of presence everywhere. But in poor neighborhoods like favela, they don't come in a militarized way, like guns blazing, and ignore needs and rights. So the NGOs try to make up for this absence of public policies and mitigate its effects. There are places where democracy has never arrived, never. So during the pandemic, many organizations come together to provide everything, from food to cleaning products, masks, and informations, if the informations they need to give. So in some favelas, residents come together to explain why washing their hands and wearing masks was so important. And people were going hungry, and local community organizations put together huge food drivers and donations campaigns.
What kind of dynamic evolved between civil society organizations and criminal groups that, in a sense, control some of these areas?
In some areas, you have these people ruling the neighborhood. But when you talk about this kind of needs, they have no rule on this. So you have like collectives of journalists that live there, and you have people just doing the things that they are already doing before. But now with less jobs, less support from the government, they have to do more than they used to do. In some places, the drug dealers are part of the neighborhood, like they were born there. The family lives there. So if they have money, they will give the money even for this. They also help with medical situations or hunger situations because they are part of this community. This not occur when you talk about militia, because militia usually are people that was not born there. So they just are there for money, so they don't care.
You run an organization called Fogo Cruzado that essentially tracks violence, particularly gun violence in Rio de Janeiro. What have you noticed over the course of 2020 and even this year?
During the pandemic, Fogo Cruzado tracked the tragic shootings of many volunteers who were caught in the crossfire while trying to help their communities. 5 of them died, and many of them during police operations in favelas. So this was common before and still common during the pandemic. Last year, a 14-year-old boy was shot indoors by a stray bullet during a police operation. This tragedy created a lot of outrage here. And these types of situation led us and other organizations to come together and ask the Supreme Court to intervene in Rio's security strategy. the Supreme Court ordered the police to suspend non-urgent operations with a high risk of violence in favelas in Rio. So this effect was clear. We had fewer shooting and fewer deaths, including police officer lives. So this is a huge change in this scenario. On the other hand, although there are fewer police operations, the lethality of those that take place, it's very, very, very high. In other words, the measure of the Supreme Court did not fundamentally change the police conduct. There were just fewer incidents.
Thank you to Cecilia Oliveira. So we've talked a lot about criminal governance during the pandemic, but where does this leave us moving forward? Are we set to see criminal governance thrive or be eroded? Well, before we discuss that, one last reminder that you too can be part of the conversation using the hashtag #COVIDCrimeWatch. Now, for our final conversation, I'm delighted to be joined by Alexandra Abello-Kolak, an expert from the London School of Economics who has done extensive research on criminal governance. Alexandra, do you see longer-term implications of the pandemic and its huge socioeconomic toll for criminal governance? Has it gotten stronger?
For the last year and a half, the pandemic and also the measures that have been taken to address the spread of the virus have caused important social, institutional, psychological, and economic consequences. And for the most vulnerable communities, for the most vulnerable groups, some of these consequences have created a situation that I think we have to see as crisis of human insecurity. And by that I mean situations in which an increasing number of people are experiencing threats that are interconnected and mutually reinforcing. Threats that affect their lives, affect their surviving, their livelihoods, their fundamental rights, and also situations in which the states don't have the capacity or the credibility to protect people from these threats. So what the pandemic has caused, for example, in many of the most marginalized communities that were already experiencing the consequences of historical marginalization and already having very complex and problematic relations between these residents and state institutions and criminal organizations. What we saw, for example, is that the pandemic led to increasing loss of income that then led to food insecurity, for example. And that food insecurity meant that people were struggling to feed their families 3 times a day, that people could not afford any more basic services or even accommodation. And that led, for example, to problems of mental health that then increased the risk of suicides, for example, that also increased the risk of gender violence, interpersonal violence, even drug addictions. And all these problems interconnected have created this type of crisis, human security crisis, that make people and communities much more vulnerable to the influence of criminal organizations. So in general, if we leave unattended this context of human insecurity that the pandemic has created, this necessarily will increase the opportunities of the criminal groups to improve the power or the influence in the communities, and also unworryingly, it will reduce the possibility of delegitimizing the type of violence and coercion these groups exert on the communities to protect their businesses and their activities.
Thank you, Alexandra. Antonio, we heard at the top of the program from people who live in these communities that they face extortion, violence, intimidation, and a lack of freedom. What is the one step governments could take to improve their lives?
Governments and policymakers in general, especially in developing countries, need to understand public security as more than just deploying the police. Very often we hear and see the deployment of police operations or police officers as synonym with, doing something about security. But in fact, the challenge posed by this type of criminal governance and these deeply rooted political and social roles performed by gangs, criminal groups, and other armed groups in urban areas go very much beyond just something that can be tackled with guns and police operations. It is something that requires the state, the government, the state institutions to go into the slums, to go into low-income areas and provide governance, and including, provision of basic services, things as basic as water, sanitation, electricity, and, the basic security of citizens.
Some fascinating perspectives looking ahead there. Thank you to Antônio, Alexandra, and our other guests for taking part in this important discussion. And thank you to you, our audience, watching around the world. Now, we've only been able to touch on some of Antônio's work on criminal governance during the pandemic today, but his research examines this problem in 5 cities in the developing world. You can find out more and explore other research and analysis about criminal governance and COVID-19 from GI experts by visiting the Global Initiative Against Transnational Organized Crimes website. Thank you for watching, and goodbye. Well, we certainly hope you enjoyed that video. I think it really gives you a very good idea of some of the key issues that are being uncovered in this research on criminal governance. Now, we invite you to participate in today's conversation. Please feel free to write down your questions and address them to our panelists by writing them down in the Q&A box at the bottom of your screen, and I will then read those questions out to the panelists. And remember, this discussion today is taking place in both English and Spanish. You can choose your preferred language at the bottom of your screen over there, and then you can follow the discussion in the language of your choice. And feel free to write your questions in Spanish, and we will get to those questions when the time comes. But now, though, I'd like to invite Antônio to address this. Antônio Sampaio is, of course, the senior analyst at the Global Initiative who led this research into criminal governance. Antônio, the video that we just saw certainly covers some of the key aspects of your research: the socio-political influence of gangs, the response of communities and civil society groups, and the various approaches attempted by police. But perhaps just give us just give us an idea of the key findings of your research across the 5 areas where you conducted these case studies.
Thank you, Lindy. I believe we've all heard a lot from me on the video already, so I'll try to keep it as brief as possible. But my intention is just to provide the overall conclusions now that all 5 case studies have been delivered and are available for free in our website. And the final summarizing report will be made available very, very soon. So let me just try to share my screen here with you. So this, as I believe it's clear by now, this has been the result of a year-long study of 5 different cities through comparative methodology, which means basically we went city by city, asking more or less the same questions in order to help us understand more comprehensively this problem of criminal governance. And for the sake of definitions, criminal governance we understand as instances in which armed criminal groups set and enforce rules, provide security and other basic services such as water, electricity, or internet access in an urban area. In other words, we were looking for cases of criminal groups fulfilling some of the roles that traditionally are expected from governments. These rules vary from city to city and from area to area, but they have in common the fact that they are enabled by the neglect, inefficiency, or outright complicity of state actors. And criminal governance tends to concentrate in low-income urban areas where population density and unplanned urbanization provide cover for illicit economies such as drug trafficking, plentiful opportunities for extortion, and communities that have very limited access to law enforcement and state institutions. And this ties to another common characteristic. With these pathways to state institutions closed or severely limited, the alternative emerging from criminal groups are by no means comparable to that found in wealthier areas. Instead, the enforcement of rules such as bans on robbery or rape, dispute resolution, the provision of some services often come accompanied by threats, beatings, and the expulsion of formal service providers, as will become clear. Now to the main findings. Much attention was paid at the initial months of the pandemic to the instances of criminal groups acting like local rulers, the imposition of curfews in Rio de Janeiro favelas, the distribution of some supplies in low-income Cape Town areas, Central America and Mexico, as we saw in the video, were seen as strengthening gangs' influence, power, replacing state functions, and turning gangs into the big winners of the pandemic. The study on the 5 cities has found that the pandemic has altered criminal governance, but not in the ways originally predicted. Criminal groups implemented some protective measures alongside predatory practices in low-income communities. Protective or anti-contagion measures such as curfews and food distribution were registered in few communities and primarily in the initial months of the pandemic. Curfews were registered in Rio de Janeiro, Tumaco, and San Salvador, and food distribution by gangs took place in Cape Town, San Salvador, and to a smaller degree in Rio. Even these protective measures did not come purely as charity, but were linked to intermediatory and sometimes outright threatening messages of punishment in case of disobedience. In San Salvador, for instance, the Mara Salvatrucha street gang administered severe physical punishment for some curfew violations in the form of beatings with a baseball bat, but also filmed and circulated these beatings via social media. Other times, food distribution, aid distribution, was followed by a deeper entanglement of local recipients with gangs, a greater dependence on the gangs. For instance, food distribution by Cape Town gangs, as we mentioned in the video, included pressuring the recipients of food parcels to help gangs by hiding weapons and drugs. In Rio, militias helped distribute food linked to the supported candidates for the 2020 local elections. And militias also threatened civil society activists trying to deliver independently their own aid and food supplies. The motivation of criminal groups, as far as could be garnered from available sources, also mixed self-interest for gang protection and gangs' awareness of the social responsibility as community members. In San Salvador, for instance, statements by the MS-13 leaders said, in relation to beatings of curfew violators, quote, "We are carrying out this measure because we care about the people," unquote, at the same time that the MS-13 leaders also said that the authorities would not disconnect someone with money from a ventilator to connect a gang member in case he contracted COVID. So most of the criminal groups' predatory roles, such as armed clashes between rival groups affecting local dwellers, extortion, and intimidation continued, and in some cases ended up having a greater impact on local populations due to the added economic hardship brought about by the virus. For instance, in Nairobi's informal settlements, water continued to be siphoned and sold by local mafias or gangs, usually for higher prices than in wealthier areas. In some settlements, gangs also control public toilets and charged for entrance, which can have added complications during a global pandemic. And reminding that in informal settlements in Nairobi, many communities
Many households don't have access to private toilets. So as you can see, these behaviors that sought to regulate the direct effects of COVID defy simple narratives of a strategic move by criminal organizations to replace the state or a PR campaign to garner support in local communities. Overall, the mixture of assistance and predation during the pandemic reflects the way that criminal governance adapted to the global pandemic through a hybrid process of negotiating with and imposing upon local communities. Whereas curfews were imposed in some low-income areas of Rio, Tumaco, and San Salvador, even these rules were gradually lifted and in some cases completely abandoned as local communities became less worried about the virus. Civil society organizations, on the other hand, had pretty much access to work in gang-held territories, sometimes because local organizations were already well known as community benefactors. And in the Rio de Janeiro case study, for instance, a local activist distributing food during the pandemic told us that food soldiers belonging to the local drug trafficking group would voluntarily leave their posts when they realized that food distribution was taking place. So there was this process of negotiation, sometimes even without sort of a verbal negotiation, but a sort of an informal negotiation going on between civil society and gangs, in which many times civil society was allowed access. Another important feature of was the fragmentation of gang rules and behaviors. The same gang would adopt different rules and ways to enforce regulations in different areas within the same city. So for instance, in Rio, the Red Command drug trafficking group imposed more curfews on local favela dwellers than other groups, but it did not enforce those curfews in Rocinha favela, which is one of the largest and most important favelas for drug trafficking, which is also controlled by the Red Command. In Tumaco, one armed group was facing a leadership shift during the pandemic, which allowed local gang members to get away with abusive behavior towards their own communities. The continued ability of criminal groups to regulate or control delivery of some basic urban services has exacerbated hardships during the pandemic in low-income and informal urban settlements, and highlighted how marginalized they are from official or government-regulated services. So I've already cited the example of water delivery in Nairobi. Also in Nairobi, as you can see in the picture, public transportation companies and drivers were left unemployed, and gangs that rely on the normally buzzing matatu business adapted to this downturn by becoming more aggressive, resulting in more gangs extorting the fewer matatus that managed to remain operational. But just as in the case of water and matatus, the impact of gang extortion or higher charges, for instance, in terms of electricity for inferior services, was more severe during the pandemic due to the increase in home demand. So in terms of state responses, the most widespread impact of the pandemic in terms of, the most widespread impact of the pandemic in terms of criminal governance has been the exacerbation of economic hardship and food insecurity, which increased low-income communities' dependence on solutions from actors other than the state. In many cases, such as food distribution, these needs were met by local civil society organizations, not by gangs, and activists, which mobilized quickly and efficiently to distribute food. But on other fronts, such as the cases we mentioned above, of water, electricity, cooking gas, internet, and public transportation, marginalized communities remain dependent on the whims and decisions made in an autocratic way by criminal groups. This is a stark contrast to the overall global trend of growing governmental roles in imposing anti-contagion measures and coordinating mass vaccination campaigns. In low-income urban communities of the developing world, however, this has often not been the case. While governments in the 5 countries in the study implemented some social measures, some social support measures, such as cash disbursements, job programs, these were often slow, sporadic, or failed to reach many sectors of the urban poor.
Antônio, if I can just ask you to keep an eye on the time, please.
Sure. Although this food insecurity was mitigated to some extent by civil society organizations, this problem was also, the civil society was powerless against another very widespread impact of the pandemic, during the pandemic, which was police violence. So the picture there, you can see one protest linked to that operation that we've seen in the video in Jacarezinho, Islam, which was an incursion by police officers into the Jacarezinho favela in Rio, which led to 28 people dead. And we've also seen, although not as violent, police incursions as those seen in Rio, we've also seen very heavy-handed and abusive behavior by police in Nairobi and Cape Town during the regulation and policing of the pandemic restrictions. So to conclude, the pandemic has not led to a lasting or widespread increase in criminal governance as was feared in the initial months of the pandemic. But although there were new restrictions in the form of curfews, changes to extortion practice, and food distribution, these direct responses to the pandemic were restricted to a few low-income and informal settlements and were not uniform across each city. Instead, the pandemic has confirmed the capacity for adaptation and the profound weakness or permissiveness of the state. So we can discuss the policy solutions later. Of course, as you can see, there's a lot to discuss, but I will stop there and return to Lindy. Thank you very much, and sorry it took so long.
No worries. Thank you so much, Antônio. And you're right, of course, there is so much to discuss on this topic. So again, just a reminder, we invite you to ask your questions, write them in to the Q&A box, and we'll address those questions to our panelists in a short while. For now, though, let's welcome our next panelist, Juan José Martínez da Bución. He is a social anthropologist from El Salvador and is actually the author of the San Salvador case study that featured prominently, of course, in this report. So I'll hand over now to Juan to give us an idea of the dynamics around criminal governance that are at play in El Salvador. Over to you.
Un gusto a todos los que nos escuchan. Gracias, Lindy, por darme la palabra. Prometo que seré breve. En el caso de El Salvador, quisiera empezar con un poco de contexto. El Salvador es el país más pequeño de América y uno de los países más conflictivos de la región. Y desde el principio de los 90, concretamente desde 1992, cuando termina el conflicto político-militar en El Salvador, empezamos a tener una presencia muy marcada y muy numerosa de pandillas y de pandilleros deportados, de pandillas angelinas. Las pandillas que están presentes en El Salvador, que son la Mara Salvatrucha y el Barrio 18, en realidad son pandillas de origen angelino, de origen californiano. Entonces, estas pandillas comienzan un proceso muy acelerado y muy intenso por monopolizar casi cualquier expresión criminal en El Salvador, y de esta manera fueron desplazando a casi cualquier expresión delictiva o expresión criminal, de tal forma que para finales de los 90 eran las pandillas, concretamente la Mara Salvatrucha y el Barrio 18, quienes orientaban la cotidianidad de gran parte de barrios y comunidades en El Salvador. Es decir, eran un segundo poder al margen del Estado, ¿no? Esta distribución de poder entre el Estado y las pandillas, como bien decía Antônio, esta negociación de poder entre grupos criminales y el Estado se vio mucho más acentuada cuando empieza la pandemia. Recuerden que el 13 de marzo de 2020 empieza en El Salvador una de las cuarentenas más fuertes de la región, ¿no? que va de la mano a uno de los gobiernos más autoritarios que hemos tenido en las últimas décadas, ¿no? Esto se ve expresado en las formas en las que se llevó a cabo la cuarentena. Fue una cuarentena en donde en gran medida el poder y las decisiones y sobre todo el control de la población en las calles estuvo a cargo de los militares y de los policías. Entonces fue una cuarentena que se desarrolló de una manera bastante violenta, podemos decir. En el caso de las pandillas, ¿no? Como ya dije antes, tienen un grado de control pues, muy intenso en los barrios y un grado de control en la vida cotidiana de las personas, en tanto que no solamente son estructuras criminales, y creo que en este punto un poco comparten las mismas características con los grupos de los otros países que componen este estudio. No solo son estructuras criminales, se trata en realidad de estructuras sociales, ¿no? Son grupos, obviamente grupos que cometen crímenes, pero que están rodeados de toda una carne social, de todo un entramado social que les permite ser pues una fuerza casi política dentro de los países. Es el caso de nuestras pandillas, ¿no? El Barrio 18 y la Mara Salvatrucha. Entonces, cuando empieza la cuarentena, se ve acentuada esta negociación que hablaba, como ya dije, Antônio, esta negociación de poder, que muchas veces es una negociación no explícita. Y las pandillas empezaron a tener dos roles concretamente, ¿no? Por un lado, el rol de control. En la sociedad salvadoreña, el Estado no es un Estado, aunque parezca un Estado muy autoritario, no logra cubrir a totalidad los barrios y las comunidades. Y esto deja un hueco de poder muy profundo, un hueco sobre todo de control de la población muy profundo. Y este hueco fue llenado por las pandillas, ¿no? Entonces empezaron a establecer, las diferentes pandillas empezaron a establecer una serie de normativas y una serie de lineamientos que iban en el mismo camino de los lineamientos que tenía el gobierno, ¿no? La cuarentena, no salir a la calle, usar el cubreboca. Y en este sentido, las pandillas acentuaron o incrementaron sus mecanismos de control. Uno de estos mecanismos fue, creo que lo comentaba ya Antônio, detener a algunas personas en uno de los barrios de San Salvador y azotarles muy fuertemente con un bate de béisbol. No solo fue el hecho en sí, sino el siguiente paso que dan las pandillas, que es distribuir este video por todo El Salvador, ¿no? Lo suben a internet y hacen una apuesta por distribuirlo junto con el mensaje: cumplan la cuarentena, ¿no? Entonces cumplieron, por un lado, esta labor de orden, esta labor de autoridad que ya venían cumpliendo desde antes en El Salvador y que con la cuarentena se ve acentuada. Lo segundo fue la labor de proveer, ¿no? Su rol como proveedores del barrio. En las pandillas, además de distribuir estos videos terribles, donde golpeaban a las personas, donde amenazaban de muerte a aquellos que no cumplieran las normativas, también establecieron redes de distribución de paquetes alimenticios. Es decir, distribuyeron comida. De parte de ellos, es decir, como organizaciones, distribuyeron comida, hicieron videos y los distribuyeron por el internet, por El Salvador, con el mismo objetivo y a través de las mismas redes con que distribuyeron el video de ellos golpeando a las personas. Entonces, por otro lado, también canalizaron a través de ONGs y redes espontáneas que se armaron, distribuyeron repartos de comida en diferentes barrios. Lo curioso de esto es que las pandillas, en una forma micro, desarrollaron las mismas actividades que la sociedad salvadoreña le pedía a su gobierno, ¿no? Que pusiera control y que proveyera alimentos, ¿no? Pues lo mismo se le pide a la pandilla y la pandilla responde proveyendo control y proveyendo alimentos. Como conclusión de esto, y creo que esto es bastante general por lo que he leído de los demás estudios, Creo que en realidad no tenemos que hacernos la pregunta quiénes están controlando realmente a las sociedades. Creo que la respuesta la tenemos en buena medida en este estudio. Existe una negociación constante, no verbal y explícita entre los grupos criminales y los gobiernos. En este sentido, las personas desarrollan sus actividades, desarrollan su vida teniendo como referencia a nivel macro a los gobiernos y a nivel micro, es decir, en función de la cotidianidad, a las pandillas. Con esto cerraría yo. Muchísimas gracias y muchísimas gracias, Pat, por tu traducción.
Thank you so much, Juan José Martínez de Buisson, for giving us some insight into the dynamics that are at play in El Salvador. It seems certainly that it's an environment where violence does feature quite prominently in aspects of criminal governance. If you do have questions for Juan or for Antônio, please do write them in to the Q&A box. We will continue this discussion just a little longer to accommodate your questions. Speaking of which, there is one question from Alex Duran. And Antônio, I think I'll address this question to you. Alex is coming from Bogota in Colombia and is asking, what was the role of formal local communal governance institutions or structures within these dynamics of criminal governance? In fact, I think Juan can also answer that question in relation to El Salvador, whether or not local communal governance institutions were able to kind of push back against the influence of criminal gangs.
Sure, I'll be very brief and let Juan say a few words if he wants to in regards to El Salvador, because everybody has heard too much from me already in this presentation. So it greatly depends on what anyone means with formal local governance institutions, and also on which city you're talking about. So the way that I can respond to this more broadly is that there are two types of local institutions that had a role in sort of finding the role within this pandemic in areas of criminal governance. One comprises the informal but organized sort of community organizations, NGOs, civil society organizations that often have quite important roles, and roles that are recognized even by government actors. To give you an example, one favela in Rio that I've conducted research in was the Maré favela complex, and there is an organization there called the Redes da Maré Networks, and that organization is even the Brazilian Statistics Organization, the official organization for the census and population, recognizes it as an organization that goes out and checks the population of the slum to provide the numbers, because this is the more accurate that they can get. However, they are not a formal organization, but they have had significant and very leadership role in providing aid and assistance and information during the pandemic. But that slum, that favela complex, is controlled by 3 armed groups that split that slum in different territories among themselves, and the borders can be extremely violent and risky. But that organization, because it is known and traditional and accepted by the community, they have an easier circulation through that very large slum, through those different territories and violent actors. So they have been able to do some of the work, but not not all of it, or they didn't have control over those aspects that I highlighted in my presentation, such as public services and things that are more that touch on the income of the criminal groups. And just quickly, the more formal organizations, such as the sub-municipality governments, the sort of neighborhood governmental bodies, or the local mayor's office, the city hall, they have roles in providing in helping to provide services, in regulating official providers. But as we saw in the Kenya case, and I encourage, what is his name, Alex, to look at the Kenya case study, the Nairobi case study, because there we mention how the, for instance, the water service provider in Nairobi tried to implement some measures to increase the availability of water, clean water in the slums, but they were blocked by the gangs in some instances. So sometimes the gangs oppose those, and they have to be careful to navigate around these limitations. So it is a complicated and patchy way. They, the formal local organizations, they are not completely powerless. They do act and they do, go around the gangs, but they are also limited.
Thank you so much for that, Antonio. And Juan, Jose, if you wouldn't mind answering that same question, did you find that in the El Salvador example that there are local communal governance institutions or structures, whether formal or informal, who are able to respond or to counter the influence of criminal gangs?
A ver, el tema con esto es que creo que estamos partiendo de un supuesto que probablemente no sea del todo cierto. Se entiende a estos grupos como grupos externos a los barrios que están agrediendo a los barrios. Y ciertamente son grupos que agreden a los barrios. Lo complejo de esto es que pertenecen a los barrios. Y dentro de este espacio tienen una serie de acuerdos políticos con otros grupos. Por ejemplo, en los barrios salvadoreños, los tres estamentos de poder son las iglesias evangélicas o pentecostales, que son una organización social muy fuerte, las organizaciones vecinales de desarrollo y la pandilla. Estos tres grupos se coordinan para orientar la vida cotidiana del barrio, para establecer los sistemas de normas y valores y cosmovisiones que orientan la cotidianidad de los habitantes del barrio. Sería muy difícil pensar en organizaciones que convivan en el barrio y que compitan o que peleen contra la pandilla. Y esto es una de las cuestiones que más difícil es de entender, ¿no? Porque los grupos y las pandillas realmente logran hacer una hibridación en el barrio y cumplen un propósito, no de la mejor manera, lo cumplen de una forma muy violenta y desordenada y en buena medida porque no está ahí el Estado, pero lo cumplen. Entonces, de esta forma creo que hay que entender también a estos grupos como una parte estructural de los barrios y una parte y un grupo que cumple una función que a los ojos de las personas de los barrios es necesaria.
Thank you so much, Juan. I see at the moment there are no other questions in the Q&A, but I do think it's important that we touch on one last thing. Of course, all television news and all over the world, people are starting to panic because a new COVID variant has been named, and it seems to be it seems to have a great potential for a wide spread, which really tells us that this pandemic is not over yet. So just perhaps for the sake of final remarks, Antonio and Juan, what do you think is likely to happen then in the weeks, months, and perhaps even years ahead when it comes to criminal governance? Because for now, it seems that this pandemic is still with us.
I'll let Juan start if he wants to.
De acuerdo, es muy difícil prever el futuro en estos temas. Creo que ninguno de nosotros se imaginaba en enero del 2020 la escalera de sucesos que han venido hasta hoy. Y creo que ha sido un tiempo muy doloroso. Creo que los gobiernos, desgraciadamente, y hablo en el caso de El Salvador, han aprendido, como aprenden siempre, a canalizar este factor, el factor del virus, en función de sus agendas. En el caso de El Salvador, y lo digo con mucha tristeza, el nuevo gobierno de Nayib Bukele ha utilizado, y creo que lo va a seguir haciendo, la crisis de COVID-19 para agudizar dos procesos muy marcados. Uno, agudizar el proceso autoritario, es decir, más poder a los militares, menos cuentas a la hora del manejo de los fondos, y por otro lado, centralizar el manejo del gobierno en una sola figura. La gente necesita figuras fuertes en estos tiempos de dudas, ¿no? De miedo. Y creo que los gobiernos han sabido utilizar a su favor esto muy bueno. Creo que se nos viene un tiempo, un retroceso democrático y una renovación de las lógicas políticas autoritarias. Quisiera decir algo más esperanzador, pero no puedo.
In terms of
thanks for your honesty, Juan.
I can only say that in terms of specifically criminal governance, what we saw at the beginning of the pandemic was that people in informal settlements all over the world, in the different case studies that we analyzed, we've heard stories of how they were very worried that, and also outside external observers, experts, and international organizations were very worried about the potential impact of the pandemic on informal settlements that were very densely inhabited with often poor sanitation, public infrastructure for sanitation, and clean water. And then as people began to see that the pandemic wasn't the end of the world, that the catastrophic, even though the impact overall was extremely severe, that life went on, that people were not dying on the streets, in hordes, that they started to relax the local communities. Unfortunately, or fortunately, it's just the fact that they started to relax, and the criminal organizations sort of followed that public sentiment. So the criminal organizations, they weren't concerned exactly with the well-being, with the health of the community, because even though government regulations still said you need to wear masks and maintain social distancing and curfews, the criminal organizations were happy with, after a few weeks of the pandemic, to let them move on with their lives as they wished. So this, so that was the first indication for us that that narrative that criminal gangs are replacing the state as a sort of regulator of health and a state role was not quite accurate, because they had this sort of complex changing roles in which they weren't really decided. The bottom line is that the pandemic, and as we see now, many restrictions might come back and zigzag between restrictions and non-restrictions, but that the added economic cost and social concerns, anxieties of the pandemic opened the way for these local sort of rulers, in a way, to implement their will on local populations, and that will sometimes coincides with the public health orientations of scientists and fact, and sometimes it doesn't. And there is no way for local communities to come with a little petition in their hands and say to the local criminal lord, do this and not do that because of this and this and this. So it's a local sort of autocratic rule.
And Antônio, just one last question for you. I see that's come in. Is it likely that the Global Initiative and GIZ may look at similar circumstances, but in rural areas, especially those close to protected areas where wildlife and convergent crime occurs?
I think that in many ways, rural areas, we get that. I get asked that question sometimes because of my focus, my research focus on urban violence, and why don't we look at rural areas as well? And in fact, it's a very good question, but also one that I think that we should look more importantly on more specifically on rural areas, but also we have seen in recent times how areas, I think research on criminal governance in rural areas has been very common, very prolific in terms of Colombia, in terms of some areas affected by armed conflict in Africa as well, and criminal groups. They do exert a very important role, especially in border areas, which tend to be rural or less densely inhabited, in terms of regulating illicit flows that are more intense in border areas. We see that very commonly in sub-Saharan Africa, in North and Middle Eastern, North African, Middle Eastern countries, where borders are often very, very poorly patrolled or enforced. So these sorts of roles are definitely something that has been done by many researchers, but is something that I think it's a good idea.
Thank you so much. I think we can actually leave it there for today's discussion. A big thank you to all of you who participated, who joined and listened in. We do very much value your inputs and the fact that you've just stayed with us for this hour and 20 minutes to learn more about the GI's research and in particular on today's topic. Of course, we've seen that gangs are able to adapt and transform and respond, of course, to global crises like a pandemic. And how they behaved at the beginning of the pandemic doesn't mean it'll be the same way that they'll continue to behave as we see this pandemic through for the months to come, or hopefully not much longer than that. And of course, we talked about state responses, some of which were very, very worrying indeed, and have serious implications for populations in these urban areas that are affected by criminal governance. So a big thank you to our speakers, Antônio, Sampaio, and Juan José Martínez da Buisson. Also, a thank you to Babette Ullemeyer, who gave our opening remarks. She is from the GIZ. And a very, very big thank you to Pat Guterres, who has been our translator today, patiently and wonderfully translating everything from English to Spanish. So a big thank you to you for your help. If you'd like to find out more about what was discussed today, to read the report in full, please visit the Global Initiative's website. That's globalinitiative.net. globalinitiative.net. You'll find this report and so much more on organized crime in reports and studies, policy briefs, as well as multimedia content. There's plenty for you to dig into over there. We certainly hope that you enjoyed today's webinar, and we do look forward to engaging with you once again. For today, though, from all of us, goodbye and thank you.